Hungary falling. The last remaining station. Early this morning, the Soviet troops launched a general attack on Hungary. We are requesting you to send us immediate aid in the form of parachute troops for the sake of God and freedom. Help Hungary!
November the 4th, 1956. Soviet tanks roll into the streets of Budapest. The Hungarian people defend every last street corner, but rifles are no match for tanks. Why had the people of Hungary taken to the streets? What was it that they were prepared to die for? As the Second World War was drawing to an end, the Soviet Red Army pushed forward against fierce German resistance. In October 1944, when the Red Army crossed into Hungary, the Hungarians welcomed them as liberators. But in Budapest, the fighting was at its fiercest. The Germans had orders from Hitler to resist street by street. The struggle went on for 7 weeks. Large areas of the city were completely destroyed, and thousands of people were killed. What was left of Budapest was looted by the victorious Soviet soldiers. The Soviet Union was now determined to protect its own borders by politically influencing all the Eastern European countries it had liberated. To this end, the Soviet Union introduced its own men. Men like Mátyás Rákosi, a Hungarian who'd spent years in Moscow. Men loyal to the Soviet Union and to communism. To win control of the country, where the communists numbered only a few thousand, would not be easy. So the communists worked with other political parties while building up their own propaganda machine throughout Hungary. They aimed to convince the people that communism was the best choice for their future. But when free elections were held in November 1945, the communists got only 17% of the vote. The new government did include some communists, like Imre Nagy, as Minister of Agriculture, seen here being filmed by the Soviets discussing his popular land redistribution policy. Before the war, less than 1% of landowners owned roughly half the entire countryside, ruling over poor peasants who made up most of the population. Nagy rejected the ruthless collectivization which had marked Soviet agricultural policy in the 1930s, and instead handed over vast areas of land to the peasants. But the man who led the communists to total control was Mátyás Rákosi. In 1946, he began cutting out his rivals one by one, driving them into exile or prison. In 1947, a great show was made of running a free election and encouraging everyone to vote. But the communist victory was accompanied by intimidation, political trial, and fraud. Rákosi was now determined to sweep away all opposition. First on his list was Cardinal Mindszenty, head of the Catholic Church. He'd spoken out against the communists and so was arrested, put on trial, and imprisoned for life. No one was safe, not even loyal party members like Foreign Minister Laszlo Rojk, who was arrested, tried, and hanged. In the 1949 election, there were no opposition candidates. Rákosi had succeeded in turning Hungary into a one-party state. Now he made it clear that the country would be run along Soviet lines, and the worst years of Stalinist oppression began. Rákosi's words and promises didn't match the reality experienced by the Hungarians. Matt Sarkozy remembers those years very well.
I was 13 when Mátyás Rákosi announced the People's Republic of Hungary. Everywhere around me, the communist propaganda machine was churning out information on how Rákosi is going to lead Hungary into a wonderful future. At school, we had to learn Russian and join the young pioneers. I didn't know what indoctrination and propaganda meant until my mother told me that not always everything is what it seems to be. Pictures and words can lie. From then on, I listened more carefully for what I was being told.
The
These heavy-stepping oxen were presented by the Soviet people to the free peasants of a liberated country. Like cotton wool clouds in the sky, Soviet cotton drifts to Hungary to feed our hungry textile machinery, so our freezing workers can clad themselves in warm materials. We are fighting the grain battle for our new bread. An ocean of grain fields await us, and we are expecting a good harvest.
Of course, none of this was true. The communists used the newsreel for propaganda every time we went to the cinema. We were bombarded with it. Every Hungarian looking at this piece of newsreel knows that these are Hungarian cattle and not Russian cattle, because they are completely different. Far from presenting them to the Hungarian peasants, the Russian army took them away. Freezing Hungarian workers were not clad in warm materials. They were too expensive. It took 3 months' wages to buy one winter coat. These happy, smiling faces hid the grim realities of forced collectivization. We lived in Budapest, in the city, but through the lack of food in the shops, we realized the problems of the countryside. For the first time in living memory, there was a shortage of potatoes and bread. While we went hungry, the Russians took an enormous amount of food out of the country.
Things were no better in industry. Rákosi wanted Hungary to be industrialized as rapidly as possible. In 1950, he'd announced plans to make Hungary a country of iron and steel. An amazing ambition for a nation that lacked the raw materials. To ensure rapid expansion, high production targets were set. If you didn't reach them, you were an enemy of the people. If you did, you were a good communist.
Stakhanovite Mihai Dubsky, leader of the brigade, personally looks after the feeding of the furnace. He breaks with old methods. He feeds oxygen to the furnace, constantly reaching the top of the permitted level, and achieves a 15-minute faster tapping time. Imre Morsk fulfilled his work norm not at 100, but 2,000% with new Soviet-made machinery.
Later on, we learned that these very high production figures attributed to star workers like Mihai Dubsky and Imre Muska were just another lie. The workers were very bitter. They resented the state asking for much more work for such miserable wages. The only way to reach impossible production targets was to cheat. While production rose, the quality of goods plummeted. I remember a family friend telling us a story of her husband at work, hammering screws into washing machines rather than screwing them in to speed up production. And there were other stories of injection needles bending while being used, and my own shoes falling apart after 2 days. And all the time, the propaganda machine was telling us of communist victory.
Forward on the road of socialism towards new victories and successes.
Why did people keep applauding Rákosi, knowing what he said was untrue? The answer, fear. Fear controlled the population. To whisper complaint against the ruling communist regime or the Soviet Union was to risk imprisonment or death. Rákosi's secret police, the AVO, were everywhere. They had files on everyone, and no one could be sure who the informers were. In 1951 and 52, thousands of people were deported to the mines, state farms or concentration camps. 1 family in 5 had a member of the family, or at least a close friend, taken. It was impossible to escape the terror.
My mother's first husband was arrested, and we were terrified to be deported to the country. Like many families all over Hungary, we feared the AVO to turn up during the middle of the night to take us away. Fear drove many to suicide. During this time, 2,000 people were executed. I hated Rákosi and hated the Soviet Union. instead of indoctrinating our generation with the ideals of communism, they sowed the seed of revolt.
Many felt the same way as Mat Sarkozy, and in 1953, when Stalin died, cracks appeared in his empire in Eastern Europe. Workers in East Germany rebelled, demanding more pay. Fearing the same thing might happen in Hungary, the new leadership in Moscow replaced Rákosi with Imre Nagy, who quickly announced a series of popular reforms. Heavy industry was to slow down its rate of expansion. Collective farms could choose to disband, and free markets returned. But the Soviets were uncomfortable with the speed of this reform, and within 2 years, Rákosi had regained power. The people, though, were no longer prepared to endure strict communist rule. In February 1956, Khrushchev made a long speech that catalogued Stalin's crimes. Rákosi was now forced to admit his own errors and agreed that Laszlo Rojk's trial and execution back in 1949 had been an ideological error. Thousands attended Rojk's public reburial as a mark of their opposition to Rákosi. Publicly humiliated, he left Hungary. Throughout Eastern Europe, people clamoured for change. Mr. Gomulka, the Polish leader, won limited independence from the Soviet Union, an example the Hungarians wanted to follow. On October the 23rd, 1956, in Budapest, students held the first unofficial demonstration under communist rule. They demanded free speech, free elections, and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. Crowds gathered throughout the afternoon. Symbols of Soviet power were attacked. The hammer and sickle was ripped out of the Hungarian flag. A huge statue of Stalin was smashed up. Soviet books and propaganda were burnt. That night, demonstrators made for the headquarters of the Hungarian state radio. They wanted their demands to be broadcast to the nation. The authorities allowed a delegation into the building to negotiate, but when they failed to return, the crowd became restless. Suddenly, the AVO, the secret police, opened fire from inside. Those shots turned a peaceful protest into a revolution. News of the battle spread like wildfire, and skirmishes broke out all over the city. People got guns by disarming AVO men in the streets, others by raiding the munitions factories. A general strike was called, and thousands of workers became freedom fighters. Soviet Red Army tanks moved in to restore order. Later that day, people welcomed the news that Imre Nagy had been made Prime Minister again. But even he misjudged the mood, calling for order, calm and discipline when people were prepared to do anything to get the Soviets out.
A bus conductor was also among the people whom I was leading. And on the second day, we came to a crossroad, which was under two Russian tanks' crossfire. And we had to pass it. The poor conductress was volunteering that she will eliminate at least one of the tanks. And she was putting half a dozen hand grenades in her bag. They started to run for the tanks. When she was about 50 yards for the tanks, I think she got the first shot, but she was still running. And when she felt that she can't reach them, she started to throw hand grenades on the tank, near to her. And fortunately, one of them somehow got in the turret, because the turret door was open. And so the Russian tank blew up, but she died.
More and more people all over Hungary joined the freedom fighters. Many Hungarian soldiers, policemen, and hundreds of children. Children brought up to communism now fought Soviet soldiers. In spite of their lack of training, the Hungarians did well against the Soviet tanks, drawing them into narrow streets and dropping Molotov cocktails into their petrol tanks to destroy them. Many, like Greg Pongratz, learned how hard it was to kill for the first time.
The Russian soldiers, they were coming from door to door out on the street. And I was in a second floor window, and I had a rifle. a Mauser. And I pointed the head of the Russian soldier who was looking out, and I pulled the trigger. And I saw the Russian soldier fall down on the sidewalk, and I started to cry. It is a terrible feeling when you see that you shot somebody and is dead. I don't wish that feeling to anybody.
On Thursday, the 25th of October, at least 300 unarmed demonstrators were mown down by Arvo machine gun fire outside Parliament. They were to be avenged. The freedom fighters stormed the Arvo police headquarters. When the building was searched, the mutilated bodies of a group of students were found in the basement. In revenge, Arvo guards were flung out onto the street along with their secret files. There was no mercy. All over Hungary, Arvo were beaten to death. After 5 days of bloody battles, it was the freedom fighters who controlled the streets. They had won. Untrained civilians had beaten the ruthless Arvo and 2 Soviet divisions. Imre Nagy now called for the removal of the Soviet occupying forces. On Monday, October the 29th, Soviet tanks withdrew from Budapest. On the banks of the Danube, people watched the families of Soviet diplomats packing their bags. The Hungarians who looked on hoped that some support for their stand would come from the West. People read uncensored papers and pamphlets for news of the changes sweeping across the country. Hungarians enjoyed a marvelous few days, a reprieve. Budapest was alive with a new sense of freedom. There was time to treat the wounded. The prisons were opened and out came the victims of years of repression, including Cardinal Mindszenty. These days of liberation were to be short-lived. The Soviet leaders were worried by Nagy's announcement of free elections, which could mean the end of communist rule. There were also rumors that he intended withdrawing Hungary from the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern European military alliance controlled by the Soviet Union. On Thursday, November the 1st, thousands of Soviet soldiers and tanks crossed back into Hungary. That evening, Imre Nagy broadcast that if these soldiers weren't withdrawn, the government would proclaim Hungarian neutrality and break away from Soviet control. Nagy had gone too far. With growing unrest in several East European countries, the Soviets needed to set an example. Soviet tanks re-entered Budapest early on November the 4th to crush the revolution. The battle was bloody and one-sided. Where resistance was discovered, whole buildings were brought down. The world looked on as the Soviets savagely reimposed their rule on Hungary. Imre Nagy fled to the Yugoslav embassy, but was later arrested by the Soviets and, like hundreds of others, was executed. During the weeks that followed, 200,000 people fled the country, while thousands more were arrested and sent to labor camps. Up to 3,000 Hungarians were killed in their bid for freedom in 1956.